Well, and then this kind of speaks, I guess, indirectly to the big question of what I want to talk to you about today, which is, there's a whole kind of structure around how science is done. And specifically, of course, we're looking at it through the angle of health science and public health and so forth, which, you've argued needs dramatic reform, and that everything that's happened over the last few years is indicator of that.
Well, I'm very concerned, and I'm very concerned that 400 years of enlightenment, of scientific progress, may come to an end. And I think we have to work very hard to avoid that, because science is important. It's an important part of our culture and our civilization and how we live and how we reason.
I'm going to jump in. Okay, so that is, of course, a very big thing to say. 400 years of enlightenment coming to an end. What exactly are you seeing coming to an end?
For science, you have to have open discourse, open discussions. I want scientists to have different views than I do on a topic. I want them to be able to express that, so that I can learn from them and either change my view or argue against their views. And new ideas always comes from the fringe in science. So we have to encourage new ideas to come up. And we can't have science to become a religion where there are dogmas, as it has been during this pandemic. We have had dogmas on things that are not based on science at all. And then people who question it has been censored or slandered or smeared, and that is something that has sort of come from the very top of the scientific establishment. And the trust in science and the trust in public health has deteriorated, and for good reasons. You shouldn't trust a system that's not operating properly in a scientific manner. The major fatality of this pandemic has been all the people who have died. But another fatality has been science and public health, and the trust in science and public health. And that's something that we have to work very, very hard to restore, to deserve that trust again.
We live in an era of censorship and disinformation, and it can be really hard to know what's true and what's false in this information climate. To get honest information and insights you can trust, join us on Epoch TV. You can sign up for your 14-day free trial at ept.ms/freetrialjan. That's ept.ms/freetrialjan. One of the reactions to people not trusting the system increasingly, like you're suggesting, has been a much bigger focus on what they call fighting misinformation, which there is certainly a lot of misinformation out there, and disinformation for that matter, not just misinformation. And just, your quick thoughts on this.
I don't think we should have the misinformation police, because I think scientists and with the help of journals and the public will sort of sort that out if everybody's sort of allowed to express their views. So we have a lot of things that are censored as misinformation that then we find out later turn out to be true. And that's very dangerous. One example where science was drawing was in national immunity after recovering from COVID infection. We have known that if you have had an infection, you will typically develop immunity, and then that will protect you as you go forward. So if you get infected a second time, you may not at all get infected at all, or you might have just a mild disease because you have no immune system that protects you. We have known these things since for 2,500 years, since the Athenian plague in 430 BC. And suddenly we don't. We sort of dismiss that. It's thrown out the window. We have a large group of scientists who, in the fall of 2020, wrote a petition that was published by Lancet, which is one of the most famous medical journals out of the UK, questioning national immunity after recovering from COVID. We currently have a director of the CDC who was one of the signers of that petition. And that's pretty astonishing to have a CDC director who does not recognize natural immunity after having recovered from COVID. And it's pretty astonishing to have universities and university presidents and hospital presidents including famous university hospital presidents, who fire staff who have natural immunity from having recovered from COVID, which is superior to immunity from vaccines. So instead, the hospital should hire these people, should hire nurses who have recovered from COVID, and use them for the more sensitive patients, the older in the geriatric wards or in the ICUs, because they're the ones who are least likely to spread COVID to these older, frail patients who we need to protect. So I can't understand how universities and hospitals are firing the staff who are least likely to spread this disease.
Of course, the general situation is when there's a disease, someone has the disease, they get through it, they get immunity. There was a suggestion that somehow COVID might be an outlier. So I guess it's not necessarily obvious to the layperson that they should just assume that yes, natural immunity will be what will happen, right? Like, why are you so convinced? 2,500 years.
Well, that's how most infectious diseases work. There are exceptions, like AIDS, for example, and that's how our whole immune system is sort of built. And when it comes to COVID, there are 4 other coronaviruses that are circulating endemically in the population, and we have immunity in all those 4. We have, so there's no reason to believe that COVID would act differently. We know, what vaccines do is sort of to try to mimic a natural infection without the bad consequences of maybe dying. So the vaccine is sort of meant to sort of stimulate your own immune system. So it would be shocking if the vaccine gave better immunity than having recovered from the disease.
Yeah.
If it can do equally well, that's a very successful vaccine. In terms of the COVID, 3 months after the start of the pandemic, we knew that there were protection for at least 3 months. 6 months after the start of the pandemic, we knew there was protection for at least 6 months. A year after the start of the pandemic, we knew there was protection for at least a year. We obviously didn't have any studies comparing natural immunity to the vaccines before the vaccines were given. But in the summer of 2021, half a year after vaccines came on the market, we already knew from a study, for example, in Israel, that if you were vaccinated, you had 27 times higher risk of a symptomatic infection compared to if you had recovered from COVID without being vaccinated. And there were somewhat different numbers for hospitalizations, but for death, there were 0 deaths in both groups. So both vaccines and natural immunity protected you very well against death. And of course, now we know that even if you have had the vaccine, you will eventually get COVID. And the pandemic will end, and that's something we've said for a long time. The pandemic will end when most people have had COVID, and then you have natural immunity, and then it will be endemic. And people will still get it, but then it will be milder until you're 93 years old, when maybe your immune system is very weak, and then you might die from COVID after the 5th time of being infected, for example.